Nelson Mandela. Introduction. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, born Rolihlahla Mandela on the 18th of July, 1918 and passing away on the 5th of December, 2013, was a South African anti-apartheid activist and statesman who served as the first president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999. He was the country's first black head of state and the first elected in a fully representative democratic election. His administration focused on dismantling the legacy of apartheid by fostering racial reconciliation and a multiracial democracy. Ideologically an African nationalist and socialist, he served as the president of the African National Congress (ANC) party from 1991 to 1997. A Xhosa, Mandela was born into the Thembu royal family in Umkhonto, South Africa. He studied law at the University of Fort Hare and the University of Witwatersrand before working as a lawyer in Johannesburg. There he became involved in anti-colonial and African nationalist politics, joining the ANC in 1943 and co-founding its Youth League in 1944. After the National Party's white-only government established apartheid, a system of racial segregation that privileged whites, Mandela and the ANC committed themselves to its overthrow. He was appointed president of the ANC's Transvaal branch, rising to prominence for his involvement in the 1952 Defiance Campaign and the 1955 Congress of the People. He was repeatedly arrested for seditious activities and was unsuccessfully prosecuted in the 1956 Treason Trial. Influenced by Marxism, he secretly joined the banned South African Communist Party, SACP. Although initially committed to non-violent protest, in association with the SACP, he co-founded the militant Umkhonto Sizwe in 1961 that led a sabotage campaign against the apartheid government. He was arrested and imprisoned in 1962, and, following the Rivonia Trial, was sentenced to life imprisonment for conspiring to overthrow the state. Mandela served 27 years in prison, split between Robben Island, Pollsmoor prison, and Verster prison. Amid growing domestic and international pressure and fears of racial civil war, President F.W. de Klerk released him in 1990. Mandela and de Klerk led efforts to negotiate an end to apartheid, which resulted in the 1994 multiracial general election in which Mandela led the ANC to victory and became president. Leading a broad coalition government which promulgated a new constitution, Mandela emphasized reconciliation between the country's racial groups and created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate past human rights abuses. Economically, his administration retained its predecessor's liberal framework despite his own socialist beliefs, also introducing measures to encourage land reform, combat poverty, and expand healthcare services. Internationally, Mandela acted as mediator in the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing trial and served as Secretary-General of the Non-Aligned Movement from 1998 to 1999. He declined a second presidential term and was succeeded by his deputy, Thabo Mbeki. Mandela became an elder statesman and focused on combating poverty and HIV/AIDS through the charitable Nelson Mandela Foundation. Mandela was a controversial figure for much of his life. Although critics on the right denounced him as a communist terrorist and those on the far left deemed him too eager to negotiate and reconcile with apartheid supporters, he gained international acclaim for his activism. Globally regarded as an icon of democracy and social justice, he received more than 250 honors, including the Nobel Peace Prize. He is held in deep respect within South Africa, where he is often referred to by his Thembu clan name, Madiba, and described as the father of the nation. Early life of Nelson Mandela. Childhood, 1918 to 1934. Mandela was born on the 18th of July, 1918 in the village of Umkhonto in Umkhonto, then part of South Africa's Cape Province. He was given the forename Rolihlahla, a Xhosa term colloquially meaning troublemaker, and in later years became known by his clan name, Madiba. His patrilineal great-grandfather, Ngubengcuka, was ruler of the Thembu Kingdom in the Transkei territories of South Africa's modern Eastern Cape Province. One of Ngubengcuka's sons, named Mandela, was Nelson's grandfather and the source of his surname. Because Mandela was the king's child by a wife of the Xiba clan, a so-called left-hand house, the descendants of his cadet branch of the royal family were morganatic, ineligible to inherit the throne but recognized as hereditary royal councillors. Nelson Mandela's father, Gadla Henry Mfakaniaswa Mandela, was a local chief and councillor to the monarch, He was appointed to the position in 1915, after his predecessor was accused of corruption by a governing white magistrate. In 1926, Gadler was also sacked for corruption, but Nelson was told that his father had lost his job for standing up to the magistrate's unreasonable demands. A devotee of the god Kamata, Gadler was a polygamist with 4 wives, 4 sons, and 9 daughters, who lived in different villages. Nelson's mother was Gadler's 3rd wife, Nosakini Fanny, daughter of Nkedema of the Right-Hand House and a member of the Amampemvu clan of the Xhosa. Mandela later stated that his early life was dominated by traditional Xhosa custom and taboo. He grew up with 2 sisters in his mother's kraal in the village of Kunyu, where he tended herds as a cattle boy and spent much time outside with other boys. Both his parents were illiterate, but his mother, being a devout Christian, sent him to a local Methodist school when he was about 7. Baptized a Methodist, Mandela was given the English forename of Nelson by his teacher. When Mandela was about 9, his father came to stay at Kunyu, where he died of an undiagnosed ailment that Mandela believed to be lung disease. Feeling cut adrift, he later said that he inherited his father's proud rebelliousness and stubborn sense of fairness. Mandela's mother took him to the Great Place Palace at Mkhekezweni, where he was entrusted to the guardianship of the Thembu regent, Chief Jongintaba Dalindyebo. Although he did not see his mother again for many years, Mandela felt that Jongintaba and his wife Noengland treated him as their own child, raising him alongside their children. As Mandela attended church services every Sunday with his guardians, Christianity became a significant part of his life. He attended a Methodist mission school located next to the palace, where he studied English, Xhosa, history, and geography. He developed a love of African history, listening to the tales told by elderly visitors to the palace, and was influenced by the anti-imperialist rhetoric of a visiting chief, Joy E. Nevertheless, at the time he considered the European colonizers not as oppressors but as benefactors who had brought education and other benefits to southern Africa. Aged 16, he, his cousin Justice and several other boys traveled to Taihalara to undergo the Ulwaluko circumcision ritual that symbolically marked their transition from boys to men. Afterwards he was given the name Dalibunga. Mandela's mother took him to the Great Place Palace at Mkhekezweni, where he was entrusted to the guardianship of the Thembu regent, Chief Jongintaba Dalindyebo. Although he did not see his mother again for many years, Mandela felt that Jongintaba and his wife Noengland treated him as their own child, raising him alongside their children. As Mandela attended church services every Sunday with his guardians, Christianity became a significant part of his life. He attended a Methodist mission school located next to the palace, where he studied English, Xhosa, history, and geography. He developed a love of African history, listening to the tales told by elderly visitors to the palace, and was influenced by the anti-imperialist rhetoric of a visiting chief, Joy E. Nevertheless, at the time he considered the European colonizers not as oppressors but as benefactors who had brought education and other benefits to southern Africa. Aged 16, he, his cousin Justice and several other boys traveled to Taihalara to undergo the Ulwaluko circumcision ritual that symbolically marked their transition from boys to men. Afterwards he was given the name Dalibunga. Clarkberry, Healdtown, and Fort Hare, 1934 to 1940. Intending to gain skills needed to become a Privy Councillor for the Thembu Royal House, Mandela began his secondary education in 1933 at Clarkberry Methodist High School in Enkobo, a Western-style institution that was the largest school for black Africans in Thembuland. Made to socialize with other students on an equal basis, he claimed that he lost his stuck-up attitude, becoming best friends with a girl for the first time. He began playing sports and developed his lifelong love of gardening. He completed his junior certificate in 2 years, and in 1937 he moved to Healdtown, the Methodist college in Fort Beaufort attended by most Thembu royalty, including Justice. The headmaster emphasized the superiority of European culture and government, but Mandela became increasingly interested in native African culture, making his first non-Xhosa friend, a speaker of Sotho, and coming under the influence of one of his favorite teachers, a Xhosa who broke taboo by marrying a Sotho. Mandela spent much of his spare time at Healdtown as a long-distance runner and boxer, and in his second year he became a prefect. In 1939, with Jongintaba's backing, Mandela began work on a BA degree at the University of Fort Hare, an elite black institution of approximately 150 students in Alice, Eastern Cape. He studied English, anthropology, politics, native administration and Roman Dutch law in his first year, desiring to become an interpreter or clerk in the Native Affairs Department. Mandela stayed in the Wesley House dormitory, befriending his own kinsman, K.D. Matanzima, as well as Oliver Tambo, who became a close friend and comrade for decades to come. He took up ballroom dancing, performed in a drama society play about Abraham Lincoln, and gave Bible classes in the local community as part of the Student Christian Association. Although he had friends who held connections to the African National Congress, ANC, who wanted South Africa to be independent of the British Empire, Mandela avoided any involvement with the nascent movement and became a vocal supporter of the British war effort when the Second World War broke out. At the end of his first year, he became involved in a Students' Representative Council, SRC, boycott against the quality of food, for which he was suspended from the university. He never returned to complete his degree. Arriving in Johannesburg, 1941 to 1943. Returning to Mkhekezweni in December 1940, Mandela found that Jongintaba had arranged marriages for him and Justice. Dismayed, they fled to Johannesburg via Queenstown, arriving in April 1941. Mandela found work as a night watchman at Crown Mines, his first sight of South African capitalism in action, but was fired when the Induna, headman, discovered that he was a runaway. He stayed with a cousin in George Gok Township, who introduced Mandela to realtor and ANC activist Walter Sisulu. The latter secured Mandela a job as an articled clerk at the law firm of Witkin, Seidelski and Eidelman, a company run by Lazar Seidelski, a liberal Jew sympathetic to the ANC's cause. At the firm, Mandela befriended Gao Radebe, a Luby member of the ANC and Communist Party, and Nat Bregman, a Jewish communist who became his first white friend. Mandela attended Communist Party gatherings, where he was impressed that Europeans, Africans, Indians, and coloureds mixed as equals. He later stated that he did not join the party because its atheism conflicted with his Christian faith, and because he saw the South African struggle as being racially based rather than as class warfare. To continue his higher education, Mandela signed up to a University of South Africa correspondence course, working on his bachelor's degree at night. Earning a small wage, Mandela rented a room in the house of the Khoma family in the Alexandra Township. Despite being rife with poverty, crime and pollution, Alexandra always remained a special place for him. Although embarrassed by his poverty, he briefly dated a Swazi woman before unsuccessfully courting his landlord's daughter. To save money and be closer to downtown Johannesburg, Mandela moved into the compound of the Witwatersrand Native Labour Association, living among miners of various tribes. As the compound was visited by various chiefs, he once met the Queen Regent of Basutoland. In late 1941, Jongintaba visited Johannesburg, there forgiving Mandela for running away, before returning to Thembuland, where he died in the winter of 1942. After he passed his BA exams in early 1943, Mandela returned to Johannesburg to follow a political path as a lawyer rather than become a privy councillor in Thembuland. Early revolutionary activity, law studies and the ANC Youth League, 1943 to 1949. Mandela began studying law at the University of the Witwatersrand, where he was the only black African student and faced racism. There, he befriended liberal and communist European, Jewish and Indian students, among them Joe Slovo and Ruth First. Becoming increasingly politicized, Mandela marched in August 1943 in support of a successful bus boycott to reverse fare rises. Joining the ANC, he was increasingly influenced by Sisulu, spending time with other activists at Sisulu's Orlando house, including his old friend Oliver Tambo. In 1943, Mandela met Anton Lembede, an ANC member affiliated with the Africanist branch of African nationalism, which was virulently opposed to a racially united front against colonialism and imperialism or to an alliance with the communists. Despite his friendships with non-blacks and communists, Mandela embraced Lembede's views, believing that black Africans should be entirely independent in their struggle for political self-determination. Deciding on the need for a youth wing to mass mobilize Africans in opposition to their subjugation, Mandela was among a delegation that approached ANC President Alfred Bettini Schumar on the subject at his home in Sophiatown. The African National Congress Youth League, ANCYL, was founded on Easter Sunday 1944 in the Bantu Men's Social Centre, with Lembede as president and Mandela as a member of its executive committee. In July 1947, Mandela rushed Lembede, who was ill, to hospital, where he died. He was succeeded as ANCYL president by the more moderate Peter Mda, who agreed to cooperate with communists and non-blacks, appointing Mandela ANCYL secretary. Mandela disagreed with Mda's approach, and in December 1947 supported an unsuccessful measure to expel communists from the ANCYL, considering their ideology UN-African. In 1947, Mandela was elected to the executive committee of the ANC's Transvaal province branch, serving under regional president C.S. Ramahano. When Ramahano acted against the wishes of the committee by cooperating with Indians and communists, Mandela was one of those who forced his resignation in the South African general election in 1948, in which only whites were permitted to vote. The Afrikaner-dominated Herenigde Nasionale Party under Daniel Francois Malan took power, soon uniting with the Afrikaner Party to form the National Party. Openly racialist, the party codified and expanded racial segregation with new apartheid legislation. Gaining increasing influence in the ANC, Mandela and his party cadre allies began advocating direct action against apartheid, such as boycotts and strikes, influenced by the tactics already employed by South Africa's Indian community. Schuman did not support these measures and was removed from the presidency in a vote of no confidence, replaced by James Moroka and a more militant executive committee containing Sijulu, Mda, Tambo, and Godfrey Pidge. Mandela later related that he and his colleagues had guided the ANC to a more radical and revolutionary path. Having devoted his time to politics, Mandela failed his final year at Witwatersrand 3 times. He was ultimately denied his degree in December 1949. Defiance Campaign and Transvaal ANC Presidency, 1950 to 1954. The ANC's tricolour flag represented black for the people, green for the land, and gold for the resources of Africa. Mandela took Schuman's place on the ANC National Executive in March 1950, and that same year was elected national president of the ANCYL. In March, the Defend Free Speech Convention was held in Johannesburg, bringing together African, Indian, and communist activists to call a May Day general strike in protest against apartheid and white minority rule. Mandela opposed the strike because it was multiracial and not ANC-led, but a majority of black workers took part, resulting in increased police repression and the introduction of the Suppression of Communism Act, 1950, affecting the actions of all protest groups. At the ANC National Conference of December 1951, he continued arguing against a racially united front, but was outvoted. Thereafter, Mandela rejected Lembede's Africanism and embraced the idea of a multiracial front against apartheid. Influenced by friends like Moses Kotane and by the Soviet Union's support for wars of national liberation, his mistrust of communism broke down and he began reading literature by Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Mao Zedong, eventually embracing the Marxist philosophy of dialectical materialism. Commenting on communism, he later stated that he found himself strongly drawn to the idea of a classless society which, to his mind, was similar to traditional African culture where life was shared and communal. In April 1952, Mandela began work at the H.M. Basner law firm, which was owned by a communist, although his increasing commitment to work and activism meant he spent less time with his family. In 1952, the ANC began preparation for a joint defiance campaign against apartheid with Indian and communist groups, founding a national voluntary board to recruit volunteers. The campaign was designed to follow the path of non-violent resistance influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. Some supported this for ethical reasons, but Mandela instead considered it pragmatic. At a Durban rally on the 22nd of June, Mandela addressed an assembled crowd of 10,000 people, initiating the campaign protests for which he was arrested and briefly interned in Marshall Square Prison. These events established Mandela as one of the best-known black political figures in South Africa. With further protests, the ANC's membership grew from 20,000 to 100,000 members. The government responded with mass arrests and introduced the Public Safety Act, 1953 to permit martial law. In May, authorities banned Transvaal ANC President J.B. Marks from making public appearances. Unable to maintain his position, he recommended Mandela as his successor. Although Africanists opposed his candidacy, Mandela was elected to be regional president in October. In July 1952, Mandela was arrested under the Suppression of Communism Act and stood trial as one of the 21 accused, among them Moroka, Sizwe, and Yusuf Dadoo in Johannesburg. Found guilty of statutory communism, a term that the government used to describe most opposition to apartheid, their sentence of 9 months hard labor was suspended for 2 years. In December, Mandela was given a 6-month ban from attending meetings or talking to more than one individual at a time, making his Transvaal ANC presidency impractical, and during this period the defiance campaign petered out. In September 1953, Andrew Kunene read out Mandela's No Easy Walk to Freedom speech at a Transvaal ANC meeting. The title was taken from a quote by Indian independence leader Jawaharlal Nehru, a seminal influence on Mandela's thought. The speech laid out a contingency plan for a scenario in which the ANC was banned. This Mandela Plan, or M-Plan, involved dividing the organization into a cell structure with a more centralized leadership. Mandela obtained work as an attorney for the firm Terblanche and Briggish, before moving to the liberal-run Hellman and Michel, passing qualification exams to become a full-fledged attorney. In August 1953, Mandela and Tambo opened their own law firm, Mandela and Tambo, operating in downtown Johannesburg. The only African-run law firm in the country, it was popular with aggrieved black people, often dealing with cases of police brutality. Disliked by the authorities, the firm was forced to relocate to a remote location after their office permit was removed under the Group Areas Act. As a result, their clientele dwindled. As a lawyer of aristocratic heritage, Mandela was part of Johannesburg's elite black middle class, and accorded much respect from the black community. Although a second daughter, Makazi Fumia, was born in May 1954, Mandela's relationship with Evelyn became strained, and she accused him of adultery. He may have had affairs with ANC member Lillian Ngoyi and Secretary Ruth Mompati. Various individuals close to Mandela in this period have stated that the latter bore him a child. Disgusted by her son's behavior, Nosekeni returned to Transkei, while Evelyn embraced the Jehovah's Witnesses and rejected Mandela's preoccupation with politics. Congress of the People and the Treason Trial, 1955 to 1961. After taking part in the unsuccessful protest to prevent the forced relocation of all black people from the Sophiatown suburb of Johannesburg in February 1955, Mandela concluded that violent action would prove necessary to end apartheid and white minority rule. On his advice, Sizwe requested weaponry from the People's Republic of China, which was denied. Although the Chinese government supported the anti-apartheid struggle, they believed the movement insufficiently prepared for guerrilla warfare. With the involvement of the South African Indian Congress, the Coloured People's Congress, the South African Congress of Trade Unions and the Congress of Democrats, the ANC planned a Congress of the People, calling on all South Africans to send in proposals for a post-apartheid era. Based on the responses, a Freedom Charter was drafted by Rusty Bernstein, calling for the creation of a democratic, non-racialist state with the nationalization of major industry. The charter was adopted at a June 1955 conference in Kliptown, which was forcibly closed down by police. The tenets of the Freedom Charter remained important for Mandela, and in 1956 he described it as an inspiration to the people of South Africa. Following the end of a second ban in September 1955, Mandela went on a working holiday to Transkei to discuss the implications of the Bantu Authorities Act, 1951 with local Xhosa chiefs, also visiting his mother and Noengland before proceeding to Cape Town. In March 1956, he received his third ban on public appearances, restricting him to Johannesburg for 5 years, but he often defied it. Mandela's marriage broke down and Evelyn left him, taking their children to live with her brother. Initiating divorce proceedings in May 1956, she claimed that Mandela had physically abused her. He denied the allegations and fought for custody of their children. She withdrew her petition of separation in November, but Mandela filed for divorce in January 1958. The divorce was finalized in March, with the children placed in Evelyn's care. During the divorce proceedings, he began courting a social worker, Winnie Madikizela, whom he married in Bizana in June 1958. She later became involved in ANC activities, spending several weeks in prison. Together they had 2 children, Zenani, born in February 1959, and Zinziswa. In December 1956, Mandela was arrested alongside most of the ANC National Executive and accused of high treason against the state. Held in Johannesburg prison amid mass protests, they underwent a preparatory examination before being granted bail. The defense's refutation began in January 1957, overseen by defense lawyer Vernon Berrange, and continued until the case was adjourned in September. In January 1958, Oswald Pirow was appointed to prosecute the case, and in February the judge ruled that there was sufficient reason for the defendants to go on trial in the Transvaal Supreme Court. The formal treason trial began in Pretoria in August 1958, with the defendants successfully applying to have the three judges, all linked to the governing National Party, replaced. In August, one charge was dropped, and in October the prosecution withdrew its indictment, submitting a reformulated version in November which argued that the ANC leadership committed high treason by advocating violent revolution, a charge the defendants denied. In April 1959, Africanists dissatisfied with the ANC's United Front approach founded the Pan-Africanist Congress, PAC. Mandela disagreed with the PAC's racially exclusionary views, describing them as immature and naive. Both parties took part in an anti-pass campaign in early 1960, in which Africans burned the passes that they were legally obliged to carry. One of the PAC-organized demonstrations was fired upon by police, resulting in the deaths of 69 protesters in the Sharpeville Massacre. The incident brought international condemnation of the government and resulted in rioting throughout South Africa, with Mandela publicly burning his pass in solidarity. Responding to the unrest, the government implemented state of emergency measures, declaring martial law and banning the ANC and PAC. In March, they arrested Mandela and other activists, imprisoning them for 5 months without charge in the unsanitary conditions of the Pretoria local prison. Imprisonment caused problems for Mandela and his co-defendants in the treason trial. Their lawyers could not reach them, and so it was decided that the lawyers would withdraw in protest until the accused were freed from prison when the state of emergency was lifted in late August 1960. Over the following months, Mandela used his free time to organize an all-in African conference near Pietermaritzburg, Natal, in March 1961, at which 1,400 anti-apartheid delegates met, agreeing on a stay-at-home strike to mark the 31st of May, the day South Africa became a republic. On the 29th of March, 1961, 6 years after the treason trial began, the judges produced a verdict of not guilty, ruling that there was insufficient evidence to convict the accused of high treason, since they had advocated neither communism nor violent revolution. The outcome embarrassed the government. MK, the SACP, and African Tour, 1961 to 1962. Disguised as a chauffeur, Mandela traveled the country incognito, organizing the ANC's new cell structure and planning a mass stay-at-home strike. The press nicknamed him the Black Pimpernel, a reference to the elusive hero of Emma Aux's novel The Scarlet Pimpernel, and the police issued a warrant for his arrest. He held secret meetings with reporters and, after the government failed to stop the strike, warned that many anti-apartheid activists would soon turn to violence through groups like the Pax Poco. He believed the ANC should form its own armed organization to direct this violence in a controlled manner, eventually convincing both the morally non-violent ANC leader Albert Lutherly and allied activist groups of its necessity. Inspired by Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement in the Cuban Revolution, Mandela, together with Sizwe and Slovo, co-founded Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, abbreviated MK, in 1961. Becoming chairman of the militant group, Mandela drew ideas from guerrilla warfare literature by Mao Zedong and Che Guevara as well as from the military theorist Karl von Clausewitz. Though initially declared separate from the ANC to protect the latter's reputation, MK was later widely recognized as the party's armed wing. Most early members were white communists who provided safe houses for Mandela. After hiding in Wolfie Kodesh's flat in Berea, he moved to the communist-owned Liliesleaf farm in Rivonia, where he was joined by Raymond Mlaba, Slovo, and Bernstein, who together drafted MK's constitution. Although Mandela later denied, for political reasons, ever having been a member of the South African Communist Party, he had in fact joined in the late 1950s or early 1960s and even served on its Central Committee. Operating through a cell structure, MK planned acts of sabotage designed to exert maximum pressure on the government while causing minimum casualties. The targets were military installations, power plants, telephone lines, and transport links, attacked at night when civilians were absent. Mandela explained that they chose sabotage because it was the least harmful option, involved no killing, and offered the best hope for future racial reconciliation. though he acknowledged that guerrilla warfare might become necessary if sabotage failed. Shortly after ANC leader Luthuli received the Nobel Peace Prize, MK announced its existence with 57 bombings on Dingane's Day, the 16th of December, 1961, followed by further attacks on New Year's Eve. The ANC decided to send Mandela as its delegate to the February 1962 meeting of the Pan-African Freedom Movement for East, Central and Southern Africa, PAFMEXA, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Traveling secretly via Bechuanaland, he first visited Tanganyika and met President Julius Nyerere. In Ethiopia he was received by Emperor Haile Selassie I and spoke at the conference immediately after the emperor. Afterwards he traveled widely across Africa to Cairo, where he admired Gamal Abdel Nasser's reforms, to Tunis, Morocco, Mali, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Senegal, collecting funds and support from leaders such as Habib Bourguiba, William Tubman, and Ahmed Sékou Touré. He then spent time in London meeting anti-apartheid activists, journalists, and politicians. Returning to Ethiopia, he began a 6-month course in guerrilla warfare but completed only 2 months before the ANC leadership urgently recalled him to South Africa. Imprisonment, arrest and Rivonia Trial, 1962 to 1964. On the 5th of August, 1962, police captured Mandela along with fellow activist Cecil Williams near Howick. Many MK members suspected an informer had revealed his location, though Mandela himself dismissed the idea. Years later it emerged that the American Central Intelligence Agency, alarmed by his communist connections, had tipped off the South African police. Jailed in Johannesburg's Marshall Square prison, Mandela faced charges of inciting workers' strikes and leaving the country without permission. Representing himself with Joe Slovo as legal advisor, he deliberately turned the courtroom into a platform to expose the ANC's moral opposition to racism while supporters demonstrated outside. Moved to Pretoria, where Winnie was able to visit, he began correspondence studies for a Bachelor of Laws degree through the University of London. When the hearing opened in October, Mandela disrupted proceedings by appearing in traditional Xhosa karos, refusing to call witnesses, and transforming his plea in mitigation into a political speech. Found guilty, he was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. As he left the dock, the public gallery erupted in song. On the 11th of July, 1963, police raided Liliesleaf Farm in Rivonia, arresting everyone present and seizing large quantities of documents that detailed MK activities and directly implicated Mandela. The Rivonia Trial opened in the Pretoria Supreme Court that October. Mandela and his co-accused faced 4 counts of sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government by violence. The chief prosecutor was Percy Utah. The original case collapsed for lack of evidence, but Utah reformulated the charges and, from December 1963 to February 1964, presented 173 witnesses and thousands of documents and photographs. 4 of the accused denied any involvement with MK, but Mandela and 5 others openly admitted to sabotage while insisting they had never agreed to launch guerrilla war against the government. They used the trial to broadcast their political cause to the world. At the start of the defense case, Mandela delivered his famous 3-hour "I am prepared to die" speech from the dock. Inspired by Fidel Castro's "History Will Absolve Me" address and carefully edited with help from Nadine Gordimer and Anthony Sampson, the speech was published across the globe despite official censorship. The trial attracted intense international attention. Protests and calls for clemency came from the United Nations and the World Peace Council, and the University of London Union elected Mandela its honorary president. On the 12th of June, 1964, Judge Quartus de Wet found Mandela and 2 co-accused guilty on all charges. Although the prosecution had demanded the death penalty, the judge sentenced them to life imprisonment. Robben Island, 1964 to 1982. In 1964, Mandela and his Rivonia Trial co-accused were flown to Robben Island, where they would spend the next 18 years. Isolated from ordinary criminals in Section B, Mandela lived in a damp concrete cell measuring 8 by 7 feet, sleeping on a straw mat. White warders verbally and physically harassed the political prisoners. Their days were spent breaking rocks into gravel until, in January 1965, they were sent to labor in a blinding lime quarry. Forbidden at first to wear sunglasses, Mandela suffered permanent eye damage from the glare. At night he studied for his Bachelor of Laws degree through a University of London correspondence course, though newspapers were banned and he was repeatedly placed in solitary confinement for possessing smuggled news clippings. Classified as a Class D prisoner, the lowest grade, he was allowed only one visit and one heavily censored letter every 6 months. The political prisoners responded with work strikes and hunger strikes, which Mandela saw as a small-scale version of the broader struggle against apartheid. They elected him to their four-man leadership group alongside Sizwe, Govan Mbeki, and Raymond Mlaba. Through a body named Alundi, he built relationships with prisoners from other organizations, including the PAC. Prisoners lectured one another on their areas of expertise in what became known as the University of Robben Island, and Mandela engaged in long socio-political debates with his comrades. While attending Christian services, he also studied Islam and deliberately learned Afrikaans, hoping to win the respect of the warders and perhaps persuade some to his cause. Notable visitors included Liberal parliamentarian Helen Suzman, who campaigned for him outside, and British Labour politician Dennis Healey. His mother visited once in 1968 and died soon afterwards. The following year his eldest son Thembi was killed in a car accident. Mandela was not permitted to attend either funeral. Winnie visited infrequently because she herself was repeatedly imprisoned, and their daughters were allowed to see him for the first time only in December 1975. From 1967 prison conditions slowly improved, black prisoners were given long trousers instead of shorts, games were permitted, and food quality rose. A 1969 escape plan was abandoned after infiltration by an agent of the security police. In 1970 the brutal commander Piet Badenhorst was replaced after Mandela complained to visiting judges. His successor, Willie Willems, developed a more cooperative relationship and raised standards further. By 1975 Mandela had been upgraded to Class A, allowing far more visits and letters. He corresponded with figures such as Mangosuthu Buthelezi and Desmond Tutu, began writing his autobiography, which was smuggled to London but remained unpublished, and resumed gardening and reading when his law study privileges were briefly revoked. In the late 1960s his fame had been overshadowed by Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness movement, but many young BCM activists later joined him on the island after the 1976 Soweto uprising. Mandela sought dialogue with these militants despite criticizing their racial exclusiveness and disdain for white allies. International attention returned strongly for his 60th birthday in 1978. He received honorary doctorates and awards from Lesotho, India, and Glasgow. In March 1980, the slogan Free Mandela launched a worldwide campaign that led the United Nations Security Council to demand his release. Yet the South African government, backed by Cold War allies Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, who regarded the ANC as a communist terrorist organization, steadfastly refused. Pollsmoor Prison, 1982 to 1988. In April 1982 Mandela was transferred from Robben Island to Pollsmoor Maximum Security Prison in Tokai, Cape Town, together with Walter Sisulu, Andrew Mlangeni, Ahmed Kathrada, and Raymond Mlaba. The men believed the move was intended to isolate them and cut their influence over the younger generation of activists still on the island. Conditions at Pollsmoor were better than on Robben Island, the cells were drier and the food improved, yet Mandela missed the communal spirit and the view of the ocean. He quickly established a good relationship with the commanding officer, Brigadier Munro, who allowed him to create a roof garden where he grew vegetables and flowers. Reading remained his great solace, and he was now permitted 52 letters a year, which he used to maintain contact with comrades and family. From his cell Mandela was appointed patron of the newly formed United Democratic Front, UDF, abroad, multiracial alliance created to oppose President P.W. Botha's constitutional reforms. Those reforms had granted colored and Indian citizens limited voting rights in separate parliaments while deliberately excluding the black majority. Like the UDF, Mandela saw the plan as a cynical attempt to fragment opposition to apartheid along racial lines. South Africa in the mid-1980s descended into deepening violence. Townships burned, and many feared outright civil war. Economic pressure mounted as international banks, responding to global anti-apartheid campaigning, withdrew investment. Even Margaret Thatcher and several major banks urged Botha to release Mandela, by then the most famous political prisoner in the world, in order to calm the crisis. In February 1985, Botha offered Mandela freedom on condition that he unconditionally reject violence as a political weapon. Speaking through his daughter Zinzi at a rally in Soweto, Mandela rejected the offer in ringing terms. "What freedom am I being offered while the organization of the people remains banned? Only free men can negotiate. A prisoner cannot enter into contracts." Later that year, Mandela underwent prostate surgery and was moved to new solitary quarters on the ground floor. In 1985 and 1986, he received an international delegation hoping to broker a settlement, but the government refused serious negotiation and instead declared a state of emergency, unleashing a brutal police and army crackdown. The ANC responded with hundreds of attacks each year. The government armed vigilante groups and fueled the growing conflict between the ANC and the Zulu nationalist Umkhonto movement. Denied direct talks with Botha, Mandela began secret contact with the Minister of Justice, Kobe Coetzee, in 1987. Over the next 3 years he held 11 clandestine meetings with Coetzee and, from May 1988, with a four-man government team. The officials proposed releasing political prisoners and legalizing the ANC if the organization permanently renounced violence, severed ties with the Communist Party, and abandoned the demand for majority rule. Mandela refused, insisting that the ANC would lay down its arms only when the government renounced violence itself. His 70th birthday in July 1988 was marked by a massive tribute concert at Wembley Stadium, televised to an audience of hundreds of millions and confirming his status as a global icon. Yet privately he faced anguish when comrades informed him that Winnie had become leader of a criminal gang known as the Mandela United Football Club, responsible for kidnapping, torture, and murder in Soweto. Though urged by some to divorce her, Mandela chose loyalty and waited for the courts to establish the truth. Victor Verster prison and release, 1988 to 1990. Recovering from tuberculosis made worse by the dampness of his Pollsmoor cell, Mandela was transferred in December 1988 to Victor Verster prison near Paarl. For the first time in more than 2 decades of imprisonment, he lived in relative comfort, a warder's house with a small garden, a personal cook, and freedom to receive many visitors. He used the quiet months to complete his Bachelor of Laws degree and to maintain secret communication with the exiled ANC leader Oliver Tambo. In 1989, P.W. Botha suffered a stroke and, although he clung to the state presidency for a short while, was replaced as National Party leader by F.W. de Klerk. In July, in a surprising gesture, Botha invited Mandela to the presidential residence for tea, a meeting Mandela later described as surprisingly cordial. 6 weeks later, de Klerk became state president. Convinced that apartheid could no longer be sustained, he quietly released several senior ANC prisoners and began preparing the ground for far-reaching change. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 removed the last Cold War justification for treating the ANC as a terrorist organization. De Klerk summoned his cabinet and, despite fierce resistance from hardliners, decided to legalize all banned political organizations and to free Nelson Mandela unconditionally. In December, he met Mandela for a friendly discussion that both men found constructive. On the 2nd of February, 1990, de Klerk announced the decision to the stunned parliament, and for the first time in 20 years photographs of Mandela were permitted to appear in South African newspapers. On Sunday, the 11th of February, 1990, Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison holding Winnie's hand. The moment was broadcast live to a global audience of hundreds of millions. Driven through cheering crowds to Cape Town City Hall, he addressed the nation from the balcony. He reaffirmed his commitment to peace and reconciliation with the country's white minority, yet made clear that the armed struggle would continue as a defensive measure until apartheid violence ended. He expressed hope that negotiations would soon begin so that armed action would no longer be necessary, and declared that his life's mission remained bringing peace to the black majority and securing their right to vote in both national and local elections. That night he stayed at Archbishop Desmond Tutu's home. In the days that followed he met friends, comrades, and the press, and addressed an ecstatic crowd of 100,000 at Johannesburg's FNB Stadium. After 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela was free. End of apartheid and elections. Early negotiations, 1990 to 1991. Fresh from prison, Mandela embarked on a whirlwind African tour, meeting supporters and heads of state in Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Libya, and Algeria. He continued to Sweden for an emotional reunion with Oliver Tambo and to London, where he appeared before 72,000 people at the Wembley Stadium tribute concert. Everywhere he went, he urged governments to maintain sanctions until apartheid was dismantled. In the following months he met President François Mitterrand in France, Pope John Paul II at the Vatican, and, despite sharp differences on sanctions, Margaret Thatcher in London. In the United States he addressed both houses of Congress, visited 8 cities, and was greeted with particular warmth by African American communities. He traveled to Cuba and formed a lasting friendship with Fidel Castro, then continued to India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Australia, and Japan, though he did not visit the Soviet Union despite its long support for the ANC. In May 1990, Mandela led a multiracial ANC delegation into the first formal talks with a government team of 11 Afrikaner men. He surprised them with his knowledge of Afrikaner history and culture, helping to create an atmosphere of cautious mutual respect. The talks produced the Groot Shaw Minute, in which the government agreed to lift the state of emergency. In August, acknowledging the ANC's military weakness, Mandela offered a unilateral ceasefire, the Pretoria Minute, a decision that angered many MK fighters. He devoted the rest of the year to rebuilding and unifying the ANC, culminating in a December conference in Johannesburg attended by 1,600 delegates who found him far more moderate and conciliatory than they had expected. At the ANC's July 1991 National Conference in Durban, he openly admitted the organization's faults, promised to create a task force to secure majority rule, and was elected ANC president in place of the ailing Tambo. A new 50-member national executive, multiracial and gender-balanced, was chosen. Mandela set up his office in the ANC's newly acquired headquarters at Shell House, later renamed Luthuli House, in central Johannesburg, and moved into Winnie's large house in Soweto. Their marriage, however, was crumbling. He learned of her affair with a younger man and, though he stood by her during her trial for kidnapping and assault, she was convicted in June 1991. On the 13th of April, 1992, he announced their separation to the nation. Shortly afterwards, the ANC forced Winnie to resign from its national executive for misusing party funds, and Mandela moved to a quiet home in the leafy, mostly white suburb of Houghton. The path to a peaceful settlement was repeatedly threatened by spiraling violence, especially between ANC and Inkatha supporters in KwaZulu-Natal, where thousands died. Mandela met repeatedly with Inkatha leader Mangosuthu Buthelezi, but the ANC blocked further direct talks. He began speaking publicly of a sinister third force within the security establishment that was deliberately fueling the bloodshed, and he openly blamed President F.W. de Klerk, whom he increasingly distrusted, for failing to stop massacres such as the one at Sebokeng. In September 1991, a national peace conference in Johannesburg brought Mandela, Buthelezi, and de Klerk together to sign a peace accord, yet the killings continued. CODESA talks, 1991 to 1992. In December 1991, the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA, opened at the World Trade Center in Kempton Park, Johannesburg. Almost 230 delegates from 19 political parties filled the hall. Although Cyril Ramaphosa formally led the ANC delegation, Mandela remained the movement's towering presence. When F.W. de Klerk used his closing speech to attack ANC violence, Mandela seized the microphone and delivered a stinging rebuke, calling de Klerk the head of an illegitimate and discredited minority regime. With the National Party and the ANC dominating proceedings, the talks produced more confrontation than compromise. CODESA too convened in May 1992. De Klerk insisted on a federal system with strong protection for minorities and a rotating presidency. Mandela demanded a unitary state governed by simple majority rule. The deadlock deepened after the Boipatong massacre in June, when Inkatha militants, widely believed to have been aided by the police, killed dozens of ANC supporters. Mandela suspended negotiations, flew to Senegal to address the Organization of African Unity, and called on the United Nations to deploy peacekeepers to stop what he termed state terrorism. Back home, the ANC organized mass action, the largest strike in South African history, and huge marches on Pretoria. The Bisho massacre in September 1992, in which Transkei security forces shot dead 28 ANC marchers and 1 soldier, convinced Mandela that further mass protests would only escalate bloodshed. He resumed bilateral talks with de Klerk on condition that all political prisoners be freed, traditional Zulu weapons banned, and migrant hostile compounds fenced to curb attacks. De Klerk reluctantly accepted. The two leaders hammered out the framework for transition, a multiracial election, a 5-year government of national unity, and a constitutional assembly that would still give the National Party influence. The ANC also agreed to protect the jobs of white civil servants, concessions that provoked fierce criticism inside the movement. A liberal democratic interim constitution emerged, complete with separation of powers, a constitutional court, and a Bill of Rights modeled partly on the United States. As a compromise between federalism and unitary rule, the country would be divided into 9 provinces, each with its own premier and administration. The process was repeatedly threatened by the concerned South Africans group, COSAG, an alliance of black homeland secessionists and far-right white parties. In June 1993, members of the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging stormed the World Trade Center in Abaki, smashing windows and terrifying delegates. Days after the assassination of popular ANC leader Chris Hani in April 1993, Mandela addressed the nation on television, urging calm and unity. Soon afterwards he spoke at Oliver Tambo's funeral in Soweto. General election, 1994. The date was set, the 27th of April, 1994 would be South Africa's first fully democratic election. The ANC threw itself into campaigning with energy and optimism. 100 election offices sprang up across the country, and Mandela toured tirelessly, speaking at packed people's forums where huge crowds gathered simply to see and hear the man who had become the living symbol of freedom. The party's platform, the Reconstruction and Development Programme, RDP, promised 1 million new houses in 5 years, free education for all, and water and electricity for the millions still living without. A better life for all became the slogan, even if the details of how it would be paid for remained vague. Most newspapers, apart from the Weekly Mail and New Nation, openly opposed Mandela. They warned that an ANC victory would bring chaos, tribal war, and economic ruin, and urged readers to support the National Party or the Democratic Party instead. Mandela spent weeks abroad raising funds from wealthy donors in North America, Europe, and Asia, some of whom had quietly backed the old apartheid regime only a few years earlier. At home he unsuccessfully pushed the ANC to lower the voting age to 14, earning gentle ridicule when the idea was rejected. With secessionist groups threatening to boycott or disrupt the election, Mandela worked behind the scenes to calm white fears and bring wavering factions into the process. He met former apartheid cabinet ministers, generals, and even P.W. Botha at his wilderness retirement home. He persuaded the retired General Constant Viljoen not to lead Afrikaners into armed resistance. Together with de Klerk, he applied intense last-minute pressure on Mangosuthu Buthelezi, finally convincing Umkhonto to participate only weeks before polling day. On national television, the two leaders, Mandela and de Klerk, faced each other in a live debate. When Mandela stepped forward at the end and offered his hand, de Klerk seemed momentarily startled. The gesture was seen by many as the moral high point of the campaign. Election day itself passed with remarkably little violence, despite a few car bombs planted by a desperate AWB cell that killed 20 people. Long queues of voters, many casting a ballot for the first time in their lives, wound around schools and community halls in every corner of the country. Mandela himself voted at Olange High School in Durban, quietly placing his ballot near the grave of John Dube, the first president of the ANC. When the results were announced, the ANC had won 62.6% of the vote, a landslide, yet just short of the 2/3 needed to rewrite the constitution alone. The party swept 7 of the 9 new provinces. The National Party held the Western Cape, and Umkhonto, under controversial circumstances, took KwaZulu-Natal. Mandela acknowledged that fraud and intimidation had occurred in places but declared the result credible. South Africans of all races had chosen democracy, and the ANC's victory made Nelson Mandela's inauguration as president inevitable. Presidency of South Africa, 1994 to 1999. On the 10th of May, 1994, in a ceremony televised to 1 billion people around the world, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first black president in Pretoria. 4,000 guests, prime ministers, presidents, royalty, and liberation heroes from every continent, filled the amphitheatre at the Union Buildings. The new National Assembly had elected him unanimously the day before. He headed a government of national unity dominated by the ANC, yet deliberately inclusive. F.W. de Klerk became first deputy president and Thabo Mbeki second deputy president. Umkhonto was also given cabinet seats in line with the interim constitution. Though Mbeki had not been Mandela's original choice, he quickly became the president's most trusted lieutenant, shaping policy while Mandela concentrated on healing the nation. Mandela took the presidential office at Tuinhuis in Cape Town but left the official residence, Groot Shaw, to de Klerk. He instead settled into the nearby Westbrook Manor, renaming it Genadendel, Valley of Mercy in Afrikaans. He kept his house in Houghton, Johannesburg, and built a new home in Quinu, his childhood village in the Eastern Cape, where he loved to return, sit under the trees, and settle local disputes as an elder. At 76, he was no longer robust. He suffered various ailments and often felt lonely in the vast residences. Yet his energy remained astonishing. He welcomed pop stars, Michael Jackson, Whoopi Goldberg, the Spice Girls, and cultivated friendships with tycoons such as Harry Oppenheimer. When Queen Elizabeth II paid a state visit in 1995, he greeted her warmly, earning sharp criticism from some ANC comrades who still saw the British monarchy as a symbol of colonialism. Despite the trappings of office, Mandela lived modestly. He gave a third of his presidential salary to the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, which he established in 1995. He ended press censorship and defended media freedom, yet frequently criticized the country's newspapers for being white-owned and obsessed with crime at the expense of progress. In December 1994, his autobiography Long Walk to Freedom appeared, largely based on a manuscript written secretly on Robben Island and completed with the help of American journalist Richard Stengel. At the ANC's national conference that same month, a more militant executive was elected, including his estranged wife Winnie. Though she hinted at reconciliation, Mandela began divorce proceedings in August 1995. By then he had begun a warm relationship with Graça Machel, the widow of Mozambican President Samora Machel. They had first met in 1990 while she was still in mourning, but over the years friendship deepened into love. She accompanied him on many foreign trips, though she refused his first marriage proposal, preferring to keep a measure of independence and to divide her time between Maputo and Johannesburg. Mandela accepted her terms with characteristic grace. National reconciliation. Presiding over South Africa's fragile transition from apartheid to democracy, Mandela believed that national reconciliation was the single most important task of his presidency. He had watched other African countries collapse economically when white professionals fled after independence. He was determined that South Africa would not suffer the same fate. From his first day in office, he reached out to the white minority, assuring them that they had a secure place in what he called the Rainbow Nation. Though the ANC dominated the government of national unity, he deliberately included former adversaries. F.W. de Klerk became deputy president. Other National Party figures took the portfolios of agriculture, energy, and environment, and Mangosuthu Buthelezi was appointed Minister of Home Affairs. Longtime comrades such as Joe Slovo, Joe Modise, and Mac Maharaj filled most cabinet posts, but younger leaders like Tito Mboweni and Jeff Radebe also joined the government. Relations with de Klerk soon grew tense. Mandela felt the former president deliberately provoked him. De Klerk believed Mandela humiliated him. In early 1995, Mandela publicly rebuked de Klerk for granting amnesty to 3,500 police officers on the eve of the election and later criticized him for defending former Defense Minister Magnus Malan against murder charges. Mandela went out of his way to meet senior figures of the old order. He had tea with the prosecutor who had sought his execution at the Rivonia Trial, Percy, Utah. He visited the widow of apartheid architect Hendrik Verwoerd in her retirement home. He laid a wreath at the statue of Boer hero Daniel Theron. "Courageous people do not fear forgiving, for the sake of peace," he said. Nothing symbolized his reconciliation campaign more powerfully than his embrace of rugby. The Springboks had long been a hated emblem of Afrikaner dominance. When South Africa hosted the 1995 Rugby World Cup, Mandela urged black South Africans to support the team. At the final in Johannesburg, he walked onto the field wearing a green Springbok jersey and cap. When South Africa defeated New Zealand, He presented the Webb Ellis Cup to Captain Francois Pienaar, an Afrikaner, before 62,000 roaring fans. The image of the black president and the blonde captain embracing became one of the defining moments of the new nation. As de Klerk later acknowledged, Mandela won the hearts of millions of white rugby fans. His approach reassured many whites, but it angered some black militants. His estranged wife Winnie publicly accused the ANC of caring more about appeasing whites than helping the black majority. To confront the wounds of the past, Mandela established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission under Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The commission offered amnesty to individuals, from both sides, who fully confessed politically motivated crimes committed under apartheid. For 2 years South Africans listened to harrowing testimony of torture, bombings, and assassinations. When the final report appeared in October 1998, Mandela welcomed it, saying the commission had helped the country turn its back on the past and focus on building a shared future. Domestic programs. When Mandela took office in 1994, he inherited one of the most unequal societies on earth. Of South Africa's 40 million people, 23 million had no electricity or proper sanitation, 12 million lacked clean water, 2 million children were out of school, and a third of the adult population could not read or write. Unemployment stood at 33%, and almost half the country lived below the poverty line. The treasury was nearly empty, with a fifth of the budget consumed by debt repayment. The ambitious Reconstruction and Development Program, the ANC's election promise of houses, jobs, and services for all, had to be drastically scaled back. Nationalization and large-scale job creation were quietly abandoned. In 1996, the RDP was replaced by a new macroeconomic strategy, Growth, Employment and Redistribution, GEAR, which prioritized economic growth, fiscal discipline, and foreign investment. Many in the ANC denounced GEAR as neoliberal betrayal. Mandela defended it as the only realistic path to stability and growth. Despite the constraints, the government achieved tangible progress. Welfare spending rose steadily. Social grants, old age pensions, disability grants, and child support were equalized across racial groups for the first time. Free healthcare was introduced for pregnant women and children under 6 and later extended to all primary care users. By 1999, the ANC could point to impressive statistics: 3 million people connected to telephone lines, 1.5 million more children in school, 500 new or upgraded clinics, 2 million homes electrified, clean water brought to 3 million people, and 750,000 new houses built, sheltering nearly 3 million citizens. Land reform began slowly with the 1996 Act that protected labor tenants on white-owned farms from arbitrary eviction, especially the elderly. Arms manufacturing, a major employer, was retained but placed under stricter oversight to prevent sales to dictatorships. Tourism was aggressively promoted and quickly became a vital economic sector. Yet there were undeniable failures. Critics accused the government of moving far too slowly against the HIV/AIDS pandemic. By the end of Mandela's term, roughly 1 in 10 South Africans was HIV positive. Mandela later admitted that he had personally neglected the crisis, partly because of cultural reticence about discussing sex, and had left the issue largely to his deputy, Thabo Mbeki. Crime soared, and the country gained a reputation as one of the most dangerous in the world. Corruption scandals began to surface, tarnishing the new administration's image. Thousands of skilled white professionals emigrated, citing violent crime, higher taxes, and affirmative action policies. Mandela publicly criticized the leavers, urging them to stay and help build the country. At the same time, millions of undocumented migrants poured in from poorer African countries. Public sentiment toward these newcomers was often hostile, portraying them as criminals and a burden on services. Mandela repeatedly called on South Africans to welcome them as brothers and sisters, reminding the nation that the struggle against apartheid had been supported across the continent. His plea for generosity toward African immigrants remained one of the loneliest and least heeded of his presidency. Foreign affairs. Mandela believed that South Africa's foreign policy should place human rights at its very center, and that his country, having emerged from apartheid through negotiation rather than victory in war, had a special duty to show the world that enemies could become partners. He urged nations everywhere to choose diplomacy and reconciliation over confrontation. In September 1998, he was appointed Secretary-General of the Non-Aligned Movement and hosted its summit in Durban. From that platform he bluntly criticized Israel for obstructing peace talks with the Palestinians and called on India and Pakistan to negotiate an end to the Kashmir conflict, remarks that angered both governments. He worked hard to deepen economic ties with the fast-growing economies of East Asia, especially Malaysia, until the 1997 Asian financial crisis stalled those plans. In a controversial but pragmatic move, he established full diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China while initially retaining ties with Taiwan. Under strong pressure from Beijing, he eventually dropped recognition of Taiwan and paid a warmly received official visit to China in 1999. His friendships with leaders the West regarded as pariahs drew sharp criticism. He maintained close personal ties with Fidel Castro and Muammar Gaddafi, welcomed Castro to South Africa with full honors in 1998, and traveled to Libya to present Gaddafi with the Order of Good Hope. When Western governments and newspapers condemned these relationships, Mandela accused them of double standards and racism, insisting that the enemies of the West are not necessarily our enemies. He took a personal interest in resolving the Lockerbie bombing dispute. He proposed that the 2 Libyan suspects be tried in a neutral third country under Scottish law. All parties eventually accepted his plan, and the trial took place at Camp Zeist in the Netherlands in 1999. Across Africa, Mandela championed what Thabo Mbeki called the African Renaissance. He quietly pressed Nigeria's dictator Sani Abacha to restore democracy and, when human rights abuses worsened, became a leading voice for sanctions. As chairman of the Southern African Development Community in 1996, he tried, without success, to mediate an end to the First Congo War. In Burundi, he helped broker a settlement between Hutu and Tutsi factions that brought a measure of calm, though not a final end to ethnic killing. When a disputed election in Lesotho threatened to topple the government in 1998, South African troops intervened. The operation was authorized in Mandela's absence by acting President Mangosuthu Buthelezi, but Mandela and Mbeki endorsed the decision after the fact. Through all these initiatives, Mandela projected a simple message: South Africa would be a voice for justice, reconciliation, and African renewal on the global stage. Withdrawing from politics. In May 1996, Parliament adopted South Africa's final constitution, a document that created strong institutions to guard against the return of one-party domination or racial tyranny. F.W. de Klerk and the National Party fiercely opposed its adoption and, feeling sidelined by the ANC, withdrew from the Government of National Unity that same month. Thabo Mbeki became the sole deputy president, and the ANC filled the vacant cabinet posts. Umkhonto chose to remain in the coalition. When both Mandela and Mbeki were abroad in September 1998, Mangosuthu Buthelezi served as acting president, a sign that relations between the two former rivals had finally thawed. From the start of his presidency, Mandela had governed with a firm hand, but after the first 2 years he deliberately began handing over more and more responsibility to Mbeki. Intelligence and security remained the only portfolios he kept under close personal control. During a 1997 visit to London, he openly joked that the de facto ruler of South Africa is Thabo Mbeki and that he was shifting everything to him. At the ANC's national conference in December 1997, Mandela stepped down as party president. He had hoped Cyril Ramaphosa would succeed him, believing Mbeki too rigid and intolerant of dissent, but the delegates overwhelmingly chose Mbeki. Mandela and the leadership then backed Jacob Zuma, the popular Zulu former Robben Island prisoner, as Mbeki's deputy. Winnie Mandela challenged Zuma with fiery populist speeches, but Zuma won by a landslide. Mandela's personal life, meanwhile, was blossoming. His relationship with Graca Machel had deepened, and in February 1998, at the age of 79, he announced to the nation that he was in love with a remarkable lady. Urged by Desmond Tutu to set a moral example for the country's youth, he married Graca on his 80th birthday in July 1998. The next day, he hosted a lavish celebration attended by dignitaries from around the world. He had never intended to serve a second term. On the 29th of March, 1999, he delivered an emotional farewell address to Parliament before it adjourned for the upcoming elections. When the new Parliament convened after the ANC's victory, Mandela formally retired from office. Though support for the ANC and the government fluctuated in the polls, Mandela himself left the presidency immensely popular. In 1999, fully 80% of South Africans said they approved of the job he had done. He had become, in the eyes of the nation and the world, the living embodiment of reconciliation and hope. Post-presidency and final years. Continued activism and philanthropy, 1999 to 2004. When Mandela stepped down in June 1999, he spoke of wanting a quiet retirement, splitting his time between his Johannesburg home and the peaceful village of Cornu. He began work on a sequel to Long Walk to Freedom that would cover his presidential years, but the manuscript remained unfinished for the rest of his life. Solitude quickly proved impossible. The man who had spent 27 years in prison now found himself busier than ever. A daily whirl of meetings with presidents and pop stars, speeches, and endless requests for his presence. He channeled much of this energy into the Nelson Mandela Foundation, established in 1999 to build schools, clinics, and rural infrastructure, and, increasingly, to fight HIV/AIDS. Having later admitted that he had not done nearly enough about the epidemic while in office, he now called it a war worse than any the world had previously known. He threw his weight behind the Treatment Action Campaign and repeatedly urged Thabo Mbeki's government to provide antiretroviral treatment to all who needed it. In July 2001, he himself underwent successful treatment for prostate cancer. New initiatives followed in rapid succession: the Nelson Mandela Annual Lecture in 2002, the Mandela Rhodes Foundation at Oxford in 2003 to fund postgraduate study for promising African students, the Nelson Mandela Center of Memory, and the 46,664 concert campaign against AIDS. 46664 had been his Robben Island prisoner number. He delivered the closing address at the International AIDS Conference in Durban in 2000 and spoke again at the 2004 conference in Bangkok, insisting that tuberculosis be fought with the same urgency as HIV. When his eldest surviving son, Makgatho, died of AIDS in January 2005, Mandela held a press conference to announce the cause of death openly, deliberately breaking the taboo that still surrounded the disease in South Africa. Increasingly, he used his global platform to criticize Western foreign policy. He condemned NATO's 1999 bombing of Kosovo as an attempt by powerful nations to act as global policemen. In 2003, he denounced the impending invasion of Iraq as a tragedy driven by oil, publicly scolding George W. Bush and Tony Blair for undermining the United Nations. In one particularly controversial speech, he declared that if any country had committed unspeakable atrocities, it was the United States, pointing to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Though the remarks caused an international storm, he later rebuilt cordial relations with Bush. He remained concerned about the Libyan Lockerbie bomber Abdelbert al-Megrahi, visiting him in Scotland's Barley prison and protesting against what he called the prisoner's psychological persecution. Even in retirement, Nelson Mandela refused the quiet life he had once imagined. The world, and the causes he cared about, simply would not let him go. Retiring from retirement, 2004 to 2013. In June 2004, at the age of 85 and with his health visibly declining, Mandela announced that he was stepping back once and for all. With a gentle smile he told the world, "Don't call me, I will call you." He was, he said, retiring from retirement. The Nelson Mandela Foundation began turning down almost all public appearances and interview requests, asking people to respect his wish for calm and privacy with family and old friends. Yet even then he could not fully withdraw. In 2005 he traveled to the United States one last time to address the Brookings Institution and the NAACP, pleading for greater economic help for Africa. He met Senator Hillary Clinton, President George W. Bush, and a young senator named Barack Obama. He privately urged Zimbabwe's Robert Mugabe to resign over mounting human rights abuses. When that failed, he publicly called on Mugabe in 2007 to leave office with whatever dignity remained. On his 89th birthday, the 18th of July, 2007, Mandela gathered with Graca Machel and Desmond Tutu in Johannesburg to launch the Elders, a small group of experienced world leaders who would offer independent wisdom on the planet's most intractable problems. The idea was simple: freed from office and elections, they could speak and act with moral authority alone. His 90th birthday the following year was celebrated with a huge tribute concert in London's Hyde Park and countless events across South Africa. During Thabo Mbeki's troubled presidency, he remained loyally supportive of the ANC, yet his mere presence at public gatherings often overshadowed the sitting president. He was noticeably warmer toward Mbeki's successor, Jacob Zuma. In 2004, he had thrown his remaining political weight behind South Africa's bid to host the 2010 FIFA World Cup, calling it one of the greatest possible gifts for the country's first full decade of freedom. Though illness kept him largely out of sight during the tournament, he made a brief, emotional final public appearance at the closing ceremony in Soccer City, waving to the cheering crowd from a golf cart as the stadium erupted in affection. Between 2005 and 2013, a series of unhappy court battles involving family trusts and money overshadowed his last years. In mid-2013, while he lay gravely ill with a lung infection in a Pretoria hospital, his children and grandchildren became locked in a public legal dispute over where some of his relatives, and ultimately Mandela himself, should be buried. Even when he longed for peace, the world, and sometimes his own family, refused to let Nelson Mandela fade quietly away. Illness and death, 2011 to 2013. The long farewell began in February 2011 when Mandela, aged 92, was rushed to hospital with a respiratory infection. The sight of the world's most beloved statesman frail and on a stretcher dominated television screens everywhere. He recovered and returned home, only for the pattern to repeat. In December 2012, he was readmitted for a lung infection and gallstones. A procedure in March 2013 went well, but the infection soon returned. In June 2013, the crisis deepened. Mandela was taken back to a Pretoria hospital in serious condition with a worsening lung infection. Archbishop Thabo Makgoba came to pray at his bedside with Graca Machel. President Jacob Zuma cancelled an overseas trip to be near him. For months the nation held its breath as bulletins spoke of a man critical but stable. In September he was finally discharged to his Houghton home, still gravely ill and dependent on medical equipment. On the evening of the 5th of December, 2013, surrounded by his family, Nelson Mandela quietly slipped away. He was 95 years old. President Zuma announced the news on national television with a heavy voice. Our nation has lost its greatest son. South Africa began 10 days of mourning. The 8th of December was declared a national day of prayer and reflection. On the 10th of December, more than 80,000 people filled the FNB Stadium in Johannesburg for a memorial service in pouring rain, joined by heads of state and dignitaries from every corner of the globe. From 11 to the 13th of December, his body lay in state at the Union Buildings in Pretoria, where tens of thousands filed past the coffin to pay their respects. On the 15th of December, under a vast white marquee in the rolling hills of Qunu, he was buried with full state and military honors in the presence of family, tribal elders, and a small circle of world leaders. Nearly 90 foreign delegations traveled to South Africa to honor him. Tributes poured in from every continent. Social media overflowed with photographs, quotations, and memories. Later it emerged that a significant portion of money meant for development projects had been diverted to cover funeral costs, but the revelation did little to dim the outpouring of grief and gratitude. Mandela left an estate of about $4.1 million, divided among his widow Graca Machel, other family members, loyal staff, and several educational institutions. Yet the real inheritance he left the world was immeasurable, a living example that hatred could be overcome, that forgiveness could be chosen, and that one human life, courageously lived, could bend the arc of history toward justice. Political ideology. Nelson Mandela described himself as an African nationalist and a socialist, labels he carried from the day he joined the ANC until the end of his life. Yet he was never a rigid ideologue. He was, above all, a practical politician who believed that politics was less about abstract theory and more about telling powerful stories through one's own conduct, about living the change one wished to see. Politics, for Mandela, was moral theatre first and ideological blueprint second. He borrowed freely from many sources. From Gandhi and Nehru he took the power of non-violent resistance. From African American civil rights leaders he learned disciplined mass mobilization. From African nationalists like Kwame Nkrumah, he absorbed pride in African identity and the demand for self-determination. But he always adapted these ideas to South Africa's unique circumstances. He firmly rejected the anti-white bitterness that colored some strands of African nationalism, and he even drew lessons from the dominant Afrikaner nationalism of his oppressors, studying their sense of peoplehood and their skill at political myth-making. This shifting path, from strict non-violence to selective sabotage and back to non-violent bargaining, sets Mandela apart from pure Gandhiism. Gandhi saw non-violence as a moral absolute. Mandela saw it as the preferred means that must sometimes give way when it is rendered futile by an opponent who understands only force. In the end, his ideology defied neat categories. Scholars have called him everything from a liberal African nationalist to a decolonial humanist with socialist leanings. The truth is that he held ideas lightly and people firmly. He was willing to change methods, borrow from adversaries, and abandon cherished positions if doing so served the greater goal of a free, democratic, and reconciled South Africa. His political genius lay not in ideological purity but in moral clarity and an unerring instinct for what would work, and what was right, at each turning point in the long walk to freedom. Democracy. Nelson Mandela was a lifelong and profound believer in democracy, even though some of his speeches carried an unmistakably commanding, almost autocratic tone. In practice, he always bowed to majority decisions, even when he personally disagreed with them, and he regarded inclusivity, accountability, and freedom of speech as the unbreakable pillars of democratic life. From the 1960s onward, he consistently championed human rights and democratic values. Yet his understanding of democracy was never one-dimensional. He combined two seemingly contrasting impulses. On one hand, he revered the collective leadership traditions of the ANC and the consensus-based decision-making he had known in rural Xhosa society, which he once described as democracy in its purest form. On the other, he openly admired the British parliamentary system, calling the House of Commons the most democratic institution in the world and praising the independence of its judiciary with almost boyish enthusiasm. This blend of influences set him apart from many African nationalist and socialist contemporaries, such as Julius Nyerere, who were wary of importing Western political models wholesale. Mandela, by contrast, saw no contradiction in embracing both the modernist, rights-based liberalism of Europe and North America and the communal, consultative traditions of pre-colonial Africa. To him, they were complementary strands of a single ideal. Power must ultimately belong to the people, and no leader, not even one who had sacrificed as much as he had, could stand above the collective will. At times, however, Mandela believed that history demands decisive action. In moments of crisis, he was prepared to act firmly and quickly, sometimes without full consultation, if he judged it necessary to keep the broader democratic project alive. Critics occasionally mistook this for autocratic instinct. Supporters saw it as responsible leadership within a democratic framework. In the end, Mandela's deepest political conviction was simple yet rare. Democracy was not just a system of government but a moral compact. Leaders were servants, not masters. Power was held in trust, and the dignity of every citizen, black or white, rich or poor, was non-negotiable. That conviction, more than any specific institution or tradition, was the heartbeat of the democracy he spent his life trying to build. Socialism and Marxism. Nelson Mandela dreamed of a classless society, one in which the vast inequalities produced by apartheid and capitalism would finally be erased. He was openly hostile to unchecked private wealth, the concentration of land in a few hands, and the power of big money. During the struggle years, he spoke the language of scientific socialism and was profoundly influenced by Marxist ideas about class struggle and economic justice. The 1955 Freedom Charter, which he helped draft, demanded nationalization of the banks, the gold mines, and the land so that wealth could be shared fairly. For a period in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Mandela was far more than a sympathetic fellow traveler of Marxism. He was an active member of the South African Communist Party and even served on its Central Committee. After his death, both the ANC and the SACP confirmed this long-hidden fact. During his lifetime, the truth was kept secret, partly to avoid alarming Western governments whose support the broader liberation movement needed. Yet Mandela never saw communism as an article of faith. At the treason trial, he denied being a communist, and he repeated the denial in interviews and in his autobiography. He always insisted that the alliance with the SACP had been pragmatic. The communists were disciplined, brave, and willing to sacrifice everything for freedom. "Who is to say we were not using them?" he once asked with a wry smile. When he became president, the socialist dream collided with reality. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the global tide was running toward markets and privatization, and South Africa desperately needed foreign investment and growth. Mandela quietly shelved the Freedom Charter's more radical economic clauses and adopted policies of fiscal discipline and openness to private capital. Many on the left felt betrayed. Mandela saw it as responsible governance. He would have preferred a Scandinavian-style social democracy, generous welfare, strong unions, progressive taxation, but judged that the international climate of the early 1990s made it impossible. In the end, Mandela was neither a dogmatic Marxist nor an uncritical convert to capitalism. He was a revolutionary who became a statesman, a man who carried socialist ideals in his heart yet accepted that building a new nation sometimes required painful compromise. The classless society remained a distant star by which he steered, even as he navigated the very different waters of the real world. Personality and personal life. Nelson Mandela possessed a rare and almost magnetic charisma. People who met him, from world leaders to village children, are often described the same sensation. Time seemed to slow, and the room revolved around him. Tall, ramrod straight, always impeccably dressed, he carried himself with a quiet regal air that supporters loved to trace back to his Thembu royal blood. In the 1950s Johannesburg townships he cultivated the polished image of the African gentleman, pressed suits, perfect manners, measured speech, and in doing so became one of the continent's first modern media politicians, projecting dignity and possibility in every photograph. He changed outfits several times a day and, after 1994, made the brightly colored batik shirts so distinctly his own that they became known worldwide as Madiba shirts. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care, and though he was never a soaring orator, his speeches carried deep sincerity, gentle humor, and an unmistakable moral weight. Behind the public grace lay a deeply private man. Mandela revealed his feelings to almost no one. He neither drank nor smoked, made his own bed even in the presidential residence, and could display a quick temper or fierce stubbornness with those closest to him. Yet to strangers and opponents alike he was unfailingly courteous, warm, and attentive. He possessed an extraordinary gift for finding common ground with anyone: prison warders, conservative businessmen, rural traditionalists, radical youth, and in later life became famous for seeing the good in everyone, sometimes to the frustration of allies who felt he was too trusting. He loved Indian food, retained a boyhood passion for boxing, and never lost his interest in archaeology. Raised Methodist, he kept a loose, undogmatic Christian faith colored far more by the African philosophy of Ubuntu, the belief in a universal shared humanity, than by formal theology. Mandela was married 3 times and fathered 6 children. He could be a stern, often absent father, yet he doted on his many grandchildren. His first marriage to Evelyn Mays collapsed in 1958 amid his political absences, constant travel, and her Jehovah's Witness conviction that politics and faith could not mix. His second, to Winnie Madikizela Mandela in 1958, endured the long years of his imprisonment but unraveled in the 1990s amid infidelity on both sides and her involvement in violence and corruption. On his 80th birthday in 1998 he married Graça Machel, the widow of Mozambique's President Samora Machel, and the marriage brought him deep happiness in his final years. He was, by nature, a romantic, and biographers have noted that throughout his life, especially in his younger, more restless years, he was seldom without female companionship. In the decades after his death several women came forward claiming to be daughters born of brief relationships in the 1940s and 1950s. Without conclusive evidence the family treated these claims cautiously, and Mandela himself, in life, neither publicly acknowledged nor denied them. The man who belonged to the world always kept a part of himself private, even from those who loved him most. Reception and legacy. By the time he died, Nelson Mandela had become something far larger than a man. In South Africa he was simply the father of the nation, the founding father of its democracy, the living proof that centuries of racial tyranny could end not in blood but in reconciliation. Around the world he was a global icon, one of the handful of 20th century figures routinely mentioned in the same breath as Gandhi and Martin Luther King. A secular saint whose name evoked tolerance, forgiveness, and the possibility of a better human story. His fame had exploded while he was still in prison. Throughout the 1980s he was the world's most famous political prisoner, the face on 1 million posters, the rhythm in 1,000 protest songs. When he walked free in 1990, the myth was already so powerful that it sometimes obscured the complicated human being behind it. He himself pushed back gently against the halo. "I was not a messiah," he insisted, "but an ordinary man who had become a leader because of extraordinary circumstances." Yet the reverence only grew. The 5 years of his presidency came to be remembered, with more than a touch of nostalgia, as a golden age of hope and harmony. Successive governments were measured against the standard he set, and whenever later leaders faltered, people sighed and asked, what would Mandela have done? The admiration was not universal. To conservative Western leaders in the 1980s, he was a terrorist because he had co-founded an armed struggle. Margaret Thatcher called the ANC a typical terrorist organization. The United States kept him on its terrorism watch list until 2008. On the radical left, some accused him of betrayal, of negotiating away the revolution, abandoning the socialist promises of the Freedom Charter, and placing reconciliation with the old order above justice for the poor. Critics pointed to the millions still trapped in poverty and to the government's slow response to HIV/AIDS as evidence that the saint had feet of clay. Even the near-universal love carried its own quiet burden. The very dignity and authority that made him so effective, the chiefly bearing, the measured speech, the ability to embody an entire nation in one person, could sometimes sit uneasily with the rough and tumble of ordinary democracy. Some felt the country had begun to revere the man more than the messy, ongoing work of transformation he had tried to set in motion. And yet, when the news broke on the 5th of December, 2013, the world simply stopped. Flowers piled high beneath his statue in Parliament Square. Strangers wept in the streets of cities they had never connected to South Africa. Social media filled with the same stunned sentences, "Mandela is gone." The irony was not lost on many that millions of people carried a false memory of Mandela dying in prison decades earlier, the phenomenon that came to be called the Mandela effect. In a way it was fitting. Even in life he had already become a myth so powerful that reality itself sometimes bent to accommodate it. In the end, the controversies fade and the complexities recede. What remains is the example of a man who spent 27 years in prison without growing bitter, who walked out ready to forgive his jailers, and who used the moral authority earned in suffering to persuade a deeply divided people to choose reconciliation over revenge. Few leaders in history have carried such a burden and left behind so luminous a legacy of hope. Orders, decorations, monuments, and honors. Nelson Mandela received more than 250 major awards, honors, and decorations across his lifetime, an almost unprecedented global recognition of one man's contribution to justice and peace. The Nobel Peace Prize, shared with F.W. de Klerk in 1993, was only the most visible. He was awarded the United States Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Soviet Union's Lenin Peace Prize, Libya's Gaddafi International Prize for Human Rights, India's Bharat Ratna, 1990, Pakistan's Nishani-Pakistan, 1992, Turkey's Ataturk Peace Award, accepted in 1999 after initially declining over human rights concerns, Spain's Order of Isabella the Catholic, and Canada's Order of Canada, the first living person to be made an honorary Canadian citizen. Queen Elizabeth II appointed him Bailiff Grand Cross of the Order of St. John and personally granted him membership of the exclusive Order of Merit. Cities showered him with their highest honors. Johannesburg gave him the freedom of the city in 2004. Statues rose wherever his feet had trod, one unveiled in 2008 at the exact spot outside Victor Verster prison where he walked to freedom, another, 9 meters tall and arms outstretched in welcome, erected at the Union Buildings in Pretoria on the Day of Reconciliation 2013. In November 2009, the United Nations General Assembly declared his birthday, the 18th of July, Mandela Day, asking people everywhere to give 67 minutes to community service, 1 minute for each year he had devoted to the struggle. In 2015, the UN renamed its standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners the Mandela Rules in recognition of the dignity he brought even to his own captivity. 4 years later, the General Assembly proclaimed 2019 to 2028 the Nelson Mandela Decade of Peace. From medals and keys to cities, from bronze and marble statues to the renaming of international laws and an entire decade in his name, the world searched for every possible way to say the same simple thing: one man's life had changed the moral weather of the planet. In the end, the honors were not so much for Mandela the politician as for Mandela the idea, the living proof that courage, forgiveness, and stubborn hope could bend even the hardest history toward justice.